We've done quite a few interviews about batteries over the last, 4 or 5 years, and particularly in the last 18 months. But one of the areas that we have not delved into is battery management systems. And this sounds like kind of a technical thing, but it's really important for the adoption of modern batteries in electric vehicles, utility grids, even in houses. So I want to talk to Nadim Maluf, who's the CEO of QNOVO down in Silicon Valley. So welcome to the interview, Nadim.
Thank you, Markham, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Look, why don't you start us off with an overview of battery management systems?
So I think we're all familiar with batteries. They've been around for 100 years, and certainly in the last 10 years, they've taken prominent positions as they become the engine of electric vehicles. But battery management systems are the key to extract the efficiency, to extract the performance, and to extract the safety out of batteries. Batteries are very complex beasts. There's so much stuff happening inside, from chemical reactions to electronics to electrochemistry. And at the surface of it, they don't need any battery management systems until you start thinking about commercialization in large scale. And of course, cost, performance, and safety come all into play. And therefore, that's where battery management systems come into play. So historically, battery management systems were electronics that kind of did some background monitoring of the batteries and looking at some basic things. So for example, over voltage conditions, over current conditions, batteries tend to be very finicky when it comes to voltage and current. And so you got to put some protection limits. And that's what historically kind of they did. And over time, a bit more functionality was added. So for example, it says, hey, how much charge do I have in my battery? So when you look at your smartphone or your car, and you see that little sort of icon that says I'm at 80% or whatever that number may be. So that's kind of one of the functions of battery management systems, to measure that. But over time, it got much more complex. It got much more complex because now the batteries are supposed to give you 300 plus miles of range. Well, how do you do that while still making cars to be very cost effective? Also, when you buy a vehicle, you don't expect to have the same longevity in the vehicle as you would in your smartphone. You're perfectly happy pitching your smartphone's battery in 2 years' time, but that's not going to be good for the car. So how do you get longevity that will last you 100,000 miles, 7 years or more? But if you're a taxi, then you need more than that. So now all of a sudden you get much more complex things that will come into play.
Could you give us an example or two of exactly what that battery management system is managing inside the battery?
Indeed. So you don't manage if you don't measure. So first thing, you got to understand what you have in there. And you start by understanding, in some ways, what's going on inside the battery. Again, historically, some of the primitive or early versions of battery management systems looked at the currents and the voltage and said, okay, that's good enough. This is how much I'm doing. But that proved to be insufficient. You have to relate your measurements ultimately to what's happening with the chemistry, electrochemistry inside the battery. So for example, do I have any reactions, any chemical reactions that are reducing my ability to store charge? Do I have any secondary activities that can ultimately cause failures? And so first thing the new BMS has to do is to kind of understand and measure what's going on in there in all conditions. High temperature, low temperature, fast charging, slow charging, driving conditions. So these are extreme range of issues that you want to look into from a chemistry standpoint. So the next bit, so that's sort of where you do some sensing. And some people do it electrically, others do it with ultrasound in different ways. So that's a cost issue. Then the next bit, once you kind of have that information, is to decide, well, what do I do now? What if I detect some function that may be perhaps limiting my capability of storing charge? What do I do? How do I flag that? Or ultimately, how do we mitigate that? And so that's where the BMS comes into play to control the way you charge the battery. So there's a charge control element that feeds back into how you input the charge into the battery as you're charging the vehicle. So those sort of high-level functions of measuring, diagnosing, and then, of course, charge control. And the last bit, which is becoming more and more important right now, and that is prognostics. Estimating now what the battery is going to do in the future. Where is the health of the battery 6 months down the line? Do I expect it to be degrading more? Do I expect it to function properly? And essentially, how do I use that information to manage that asset, which is about dollars?
Now, a couple of months ago, I was interviewing an engineer who specializes in setting up EV charging in residential areas. And we were talking about, well, what happens when you get a certain volume of EVs in that neighborhood grid, and will the infrastructure be able to handle it? And he said, they're going to have to be doing some upgrades, but battery management systems are key to making sure that all of the EVs charge when they need to charge, and they don't overload the local infrastructure, so you have malfunctions and blackouts. Is that one example of battery management systems in operation?
Indeed. So let me give you one a tangible example. So Korea has invested a lot into the electrification of the grid, where they put big batteries on the grid to do things like what you said. So how do you charge batteries off hours, off peak? And so Korea has, in the last 4 or 5 years, has put in place over 1,000 battery facilities. I'm talking about large facilities, talking megawatt hours. These are gigantic facilities from an energy standpoint. So 1,000 of those facilities, very substantial. Over the last 2 years, 30 of those have caught fire. And when the government in Korea investigated that, they actually pointed to the battery management system as being one of the key issues that could have prevented those fires and didn't. And so the battery management system is responsible for not so much the energy management. So I want to distinguish between energy management, in other words, what the grid and the utilities does, what they do, versus what the batteries functions is. So the battery has one primary function, and that is to store energy, as much energy as possible, and deliver it back to the user with virtually as little cost as possible and with maximum safety. That is really what the battery management system ought to be doing, and make sure that you deliver that cost effectively. So let me give you another example. If you put a massive building up the infrastructure to deliver energy into those vehicles can be done. Utilities can put $1 billion on your block and make sure that your cars will always be charging the whole time. That is not cost effective. But you can do that with much smaller systems and have intelligent battery management systems that know how to function and operate and optimize the battery, and therefore deliver the energy to you at the lowest possible cost.
Now, I have heard, though I've never interviewed anybody from Tesla, Elon has not answered my emails requesting an interview for some reason. But apparently, one of the reasons why Tesla's performs reasonably well with its batteries is they have very good software in their battery management system. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so I think Tesla has got a bunch of things that they've done well. The battery management system software is one aspect of it, though I think they still have a lot to do. They're not as good as they think they should be, but I think certainly it's good enough. But where Tesla, I think, also shines is in the rest of the powertrain. So, for example, the motor's efficiency is one of the best in the industry. So to move their Tesla vehicle 1 mile, they need about 10-15% less energy than an equivalent vehicle. So that helps them a lot in terms of that efficiency, and the BMS certainly contributes into the equation.
What else does a BMS do inside an electric vehicle, Nadim? Because I know a lot of the people who are watching this are considering either have an EV or are considering buying an EV. And what should they be looking for in a vehicle that has a battery management system that might make it more efficient, increase the range, and that sort of thing?
So first thing, when you look at a battery in a vehicle, you're looking at actually hundreds, or in the case of Tesla, thousands of individual battery cells, what we call cells. And they're assembled together electrically and mechanically, of course. So one of the functions of the battery management system is how do you maintain the charge balance, how do you maintain the functionality, how do you manage the safety of all those individual cells so they're all working together in synchrony. From a user perspective, that's totally transparent to you. You don't get to see that. You don't get to access that. There's nothing you can do about it. What you can do, however, is control the charging manually. Since when you plug into the vehicle, that's something, a process that you are in total control of. And so the BMS also, one of its functions is to maintain the longevity of the battery. So let's say you buy a Tesla or an Audi, or whatever that favorite vehicle might be, electric vehicle could be. And then the manufacturer sort of says, look, your battery will last you 100,000 miles. And often when they say that, they really mean that after 100,000 miles, they would warrant that you would have at least 70% of your initial capacity remaining. So let's say you start with 300 miles of range on day 0. They'll warrant that after 100,000 miles, you'll have 70% of that, which is 210 miles. Losing 30% of the capacity is not okay. It's actually quite bad for a vehicle that's going to cost you $70,000, $80,000. And so the BMS, it's one of its functions is to give you that kind of longevity. You as a user, however, can override that intelligence and do more. For example, if you're not comfortable with the BMS, and to be quite blunt right now, most of the BMSs today they need a lot of work. You don't have to use the fast charger. So avoid using the supercharger if you can, unless you really have to do a trip from, say, San Francisco to Los Angeles or long distance where you need that capability. Avoid using the supercharger. It will actually damage your battery if it doesn't have the right BMS behind it. The other thing that you want to think about is if you're simply running errands, don't charge your battery in the home to 100%. Keep it at 80% or 70%. That reduced capacity also will give you longevity. So these are tidbits that as a user, as a driver, you could use to get more life from the battery.
Nadim, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insight into battery management systems, and no doubt we'll talk to you again about this.
Thank you very much, Markham.